London, 1862, a fog-choked city where a ruined name can slam every door. Cast out after a whispered scandal, Corinne Ashdown clutches a battered folio and a last thread of dignity, until a misdelivered score thrusts her into a Mayfair salon and the unwavering gaze of the Duke of Merrow. Music steadies, hearts falter, but beneath polished floors lies a secret poised to shatter reputations, and a choice no one should have to make, duty that preserves an empire, or desire that saves a soul. Someone is lying, someone is listening, and courage is about to be seen. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and one question: what do you love most about period romances, the scandal or the salvation? London, March of the year 1862. The fog clung to the cobblestones like regret, thick and sullen, curling at Corinne Ashdown's ankles as she stepped down from the omnibus. Her boots, scuffed yet polished, whispered against the cold pavement of Drury Lane. She carried no parasol, no reticule embroidered with initials, no chaperone to shield her from glances, only a leather-bound folio pressed to her chest and the echo of a name once spoken with pride: Ashdown. That name, once respected among modest circles, now slipped through London drawing rooms like a poison in teacups. It had taken less than a season to ruin her. One misplaced whisper, one coerced signature, and the comfortable life beneath her stepfather's roof vanished as swiftly as the last spring frost. Her guardian, his pride scorched by the scandal, gave her a purse with a few shillings, an old carpet-bag, and the door. The woman who had once played Chopin to softly burning hearths now inked scores in a cramped attic, her world reduced to staves, rests, and the flickering oil of her desk lamp. Corinne rented her lodgings from a widowed milliner who never asked questions and never smiled. The room was narrow, lined with books and shadows, and smelt faintly of dust and camphor, but it was hers, and it was quiet. Each morning, she walked with her folio tucked under one arm to the publisher's shop on Holborn Street, a dim, paper-strewn corner of the city where she copied music scores with the precision of a surgeon. Her hand, steady and elegant, had once impressed a conservatory patron. Now it was paid in silence by a man who never lifted his eyes from the ledgers. Her days passed in metronome rhythm: arrive, copy, deliver, return. Until the morning, the delivery boy failed to appear. Mr. Cratchley's voice, rasping and impatient, echoed from the inner room. "Miss Ashdown, since the boy has lost his way or his wits, you'll deliver these parts to number 4, Grosvenor Square, immediately." Corinne hesitated. Grosvenor Square, Mayfair, a world of rose silk parlours, liveried footmen, and polished brass knockers that would never reflect her image without condescension. "Yes, Mr. Cratchley," she murmured. She wrapped the score in brown paper and tucked it into her folio with careful hands, though her heart gave a quiet tremor. She had not stepped foot in Mayfair since her disgrace. She adjusted her bonnet, drawing the veil just low enough to cast shadow on her face, and fastened her shawl tighter. The morning air bit at her fingers as she stepped back into the city's grey breath. Grosvenor Square rose before her like a row of marble judges, grand, impassive, and far too clean. She crossed to number 4 and stared at the double door of polished oak. Her hand trembled as she lifted the brass knocker, but she willed it steady and let it fall with a dull thud. A maid answered, her brows lifting the moment she noted Corinne's attire. "Delivery," Corinne said softly, holding out the folio. The maid looked confused. "They've already begun rehearsal. You'll have to take it in yourself. Music's gone to chaos." Corinne's breath caught. I was told to deliver it." "Straight through, last door on the right," the maid said, already turning. Corinne stood a moment, frozen in the entrance hall, surrounded by the scent of beeswax and wealth. Then, tightening her grip on the folio, she stepped onto the marble floor. The music room was wide and sunlit, filled with an elegant disorder of chairs, stands, and agitated musicians. Violins trailed into frustrated silence. A conductor waved his baton in vain. At the front stood a man who did not move, who did not raise his voice, yet whose presence anchored the room more firmly than any music ever could. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark wool coat with a grey silk waistcoat, a deep crimson cravat knotted without a wrinkle. His hands were clasped behind his back. His eyes, steel blue, grave and unsparing, moved slowly from the score to the violins and back again. And then they found her. Corinne stopped breathing. Adrian Whitcomb, Duke of Merrow. She knew the name, everyone did. He was the architect of half the legislative reforms of the past decade. His voice shaped budgets, his influence placed ministers, and his face, solemn, unreadable, was the subject of every society sketchbook, though never flattered by it. She dipped into a shallow curtsy, too startled to speak. His gaze did not drop to her gown or her scuffed boots. He looked into her eyes. "You have the replacement score?" he asked. His voice was low, composed, without urgency, but not cold. She nodded, stepping forward and handing it to him. He took it, unwrapped it, and flipped through the pages. A crease formed between his brows. He gestured to the conductor. "Try from bar 68. Begin with the cello." The musicians adjusted. The room shifted. Corinne, unsure whether to stay or flee, backed toward the far wall. But she could not help listening. The music began again. This time, it held. Note after note fell into place. The tension eased from the air like mist from a field. The cello's voice deepened. The violins answered. A harmony emerged, unexpected and whole. Corinne exhaled slowly. The correction had worked. Her correction had worked. She turned to leave. "Miss—" She froze. The Duke's voice reached her again. "Miss Ashdown," she answered, turning slowly. Her cheeks flamed beneath her veil. He regarded her. "Did you copy this arrangement?" "Yes, Your Grace." His eyes held hers for a fraction longer than necessary, not with curiosity, not even admiration. It was something quieter, an assessment, a flicker of recognition that her presence, her labor, was not as invisible as the world had led her to believe. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words, but they wrapped around her like a velvet cord. She curtsied once more, heart racing, and left the room before she could say something foolish. Outside, the sun had risen above the rooftops, casting golden light across Grosvenor Square. Corinne walked back toward Holborn with her head high and her breath unsteady, unaware that behind the tall windows of number 4, a man still watched the door she had vanished through, unmoving, thoughtful and silent as the turning of a key in a long locked door. The morning after her unexpected visit to Grosvenor Square, Corinne Ashdown sat once again at her narrow desk beneath the attic's slanted roof, her ink-stained fingers trembling slightly as they traced the lines of a new score. Yet her mind, usually so firmly anchored to clefs and time signatures, drifted. The Duke had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, with that steady, unhurried gaze that neither presumed nor dismissed. And he had spoken her name aloud, softly, with intention. She pressed her hand to her chest as if to still the memory. It was nothing, she told herself, a single moment, a gentleman's civility, nothing more. And yet, beneath her ribs, something fluttered like a trapped swallow. A week passed. Then came the letter. It arrived without seal, folded in cream-coloured paper and delivered by a boy no older than 12, who vanished down the stairwell before she could ask from whom it had come. Inside, written in a neat sloping hand, was a simple note. "Miss Ashdown, my sister Lady Eugenia Lethbridge has inquired whether you might be available to assist further with musical arrangements for the upcoming charity program benefiting the Society for the Education of Young Ladies in Difficult Circumstances. The task requires discretion and delicacy. Compensation shall be appropriate. If agreeable, please present yourself Tuesday next at the tradesman's entrance, number 4, Grosvenor Square, at 10 o'clock precisely. Yours respectfully, A. Whitcomb." Her heart beat like a drum in her ears. It wasn't a summons. It was an offer, one she could refuse. But of course she wouldn't. The morning she returned to Mayfair, the fog was lighter, the air tinged with the promise of an early spring. She wore her slate-grey wool dress with the repaired hem, her boots newly brushed and her bonnet tied with a ribbon that, though faded, had once belonged to her mother. The back entrance to number 4 was quiet, a narrow path bordered by ironwork and ivy, leading to a door of dark wood where a footman glanced at her, then gestured silently. He did not ask her name. He already knew it. She was led not to the grand music room, but to a side parlour of genteel intimacy, where a woman stood beside a small pianoforte, examining sheet music with a frown of mild displeasure. She turned as Corinne entered, revealing a figure tall and straight, despite the mourning lace at her sleeves. Her hair was ash blonde, streaked with silver, braided into a crown. Her expression was neither warm nor cold, merely exact. "You are Miss Ashdown." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Corinne replied, curtsying low. "I am Lady Eugenia Lethbridge. His Grace informed me of your assistance last week. The arrangement you corrected was rendered with a remarkably clean hand. That sort of discipline is rare in girls these days." "Thank you," Corinne murmured. Lady Eugenia gestured to the pianoforte. "We are adapting several pieces for a small orchestra of young ladies. Many are without formal training. Some cannot read properly. The work will require not only skill, but patience." "I understand. You will work from the west parlour. You are not to use the front entrance. If asked, you are assisting the charity in a clerical capacity. That is all." Corinne nodded. She had expected no more. "And," Lady Eugenia added, her eyes sharp, "I do not abide lateness. Punctuality is the measure of character." "I shall be early then," Corinne replied, her voice quiet but firm. Something in Lady Eugenia's gaze shifted, just a hair. Approval, or something like it. Thus began Corinne's second life inside number 4. She came each morning, passed through corridors unseen, and spent her days arranging simplified scores for violin and flute, composing harmonies for uncertain altos, transposing sonatas into kinder keys. The parlour filled with music, sometimes discordant, sometimes astonishing in its fragile beauty. The girls arrived in laughter and uncertainty, clutching cheap instruments and bruised hope. Corinne saw herself in them, girls unwelcomed by society, seeking shelter in melody. She never expected to see the Duke again, but one afternoon, as she stood by the hearth reviewing a troublesome measure in a minor, a shadow crossed the open doorway. She turned. Adrian Whitcomb stood there, gloved hands behind his back, his coat still dusted with the frost of the late March air. Their eyes met. She curtsied instinctively. "Your Grace." He inclined his head. "Miss Ashdown." She straightened. Silence expanded between them, not awkward, but dense with things unsaid. He took a single step into the room, his gaze falling to the page in her hands. "You've removed the suspensions in the third movement," he noted. "They were too difficult for the youngest violinist," she said. "She cannot yet sustain her bow hand evenly." "She must be 11, then." 10, Corinne replied, surprised. His mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something approaching it. "You're a good judge of character." "Music reveals it," she said, then looked away, startled by her own boldness. He did not leave. Instead, he walked to the pianoforte and rested his hand lightly on its edge. "My sister says you are methodical, relentless, in fact. I find comfort in order, Your Grace." "As do I." The silence that followed was intimate, but not inappropriate. There was something reverent in it. Corinne felt as if the very room had drawn breath. She dared a glance at his face, angular, noble, yet weary in a way that had nothing to do with age. His cravat was loosely tied, his collar slightly askew. A long day behind him, 1,000 burdens yet ahead. "You should know," he said quietly, "that I do not invite people into my household lightly." Corinne felt her breath catch. "I am grateful for the opportunity." He nodded once, then turned. At the threshold he paused. "There are many who would not have returned here, Miss Ashdown. You did." He left without waiting for a reply. That night, as she walked back to her attic, the city seemed unfamiliar, the chimneys less menacing, the windows less blind. A part of her long buried stirred in her chest, a tremulous, dangerous part. She pressed a hand to it, unsure whether to nurture or silence it. Yet even as she fought to hold on to the calmness she had built brick by brick, the past began to whisper once more. In a tea shop near Covent Garden, she paused outside the window on her way home. Within, seated beside the fire, was a man she had not seen in over 2 years. Viscount Harbury. His silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, slim, elegant, in a bottle-green frock coat, a velvet collar framing his neck like a crown. He lifted a cup to his lips, laughing softly at something said by the woman across from him. Corinne stiffened. The woman was one of her former friends, Anne Loxley, the very girl who had first repeated the rumour that shattered Corinne's name. Corinne did not go inside. She did not move. Her body stood as if rooted to the icy pavement, yet her thoughts hurled back to that summer evening when a careless smile, a wine-stained card, and a private wager had turned into ruin. She had seen Harbury that night. She remembered now. The way he had stood beside her stepfather, his falcon ring glinting in the candlelight, his voice too smooth, too interested. He had not defended her when the lie was spread. He had not spoken in her favour, and now he laughed by the fire, untouched. A cold wind curled around her throat. She turned away. Her name had been tarnished by men like that, and yet today it had been spoken with grace by another. She would not forget either. The rain fell with the hush of silk being drawn across glass, veiling the windows of number 4, Grosvenor Square, in a quiet melancholy. Inside the west parlour, the fireplace crackled softly, its flame a modest sentinel against the damp cold of early April. Corinne Ashdown sat at the side table, quill in hand, carefully notating the 4th movement of a revised concerto for girls whose fingers still hesitated on their strings. Outside the heavy velvet curtain that divided the parlour from the larger salon, the girls rehearsed with varying degrees of certainty. Corinne had come to know each one by ear, the nervous tremble of little Sophie's bow arm, the confident trill of Beatrice's flute, the persistent rush of tempo from the pianist Margaret, who could not abide rests. She was not meant to be seen. That had been Lady Eugenia's condition. To sit, to listen, to adjust from the shadows. But within days of beginning, it became clear that the girls needed more than ink and staves. They needed guidance, and so Corinne had begun to coach them. Softly at first, whispered suggestions through the curtain, a gentle correction from behind. Then, when no one objected, she began to speak more directly, never stepping fully into the room, never removing the barrier that separated her from the light. But her voice had found its place. The girls responded, flourished, music bloomed. Corinne never imagined herself a teacher. But in those small gestures, adjusting Sophie's wrist, showing Margaret how to breathe between phrases, she discovered something startling. She was not only capable, she was needed. The girls adored her, even if most did not know her name. That morning, after a particularly sweet rendition of the second aria from The Rose and the Lark, Corinne stepped behind the curtain to retrieve a page she had marked in pencil. As she straightened, she felt it, that particular stillness that overtakes a room when it is no longer empty. She turned. Adrian Whitcomb, Duke of Merrow, stood at the far end of the parlour, one hand resting lightly on the back of a carved chair. He had entered without sound. The early light, caught in the rain-glazed windows behind him, framed his tall silhouette in hues of pewter and pale gold. Corinne's breath lodged in her throat. She lowered her eyes. "Your Grace." He said nothing for a moment. The fire popped softly between them. "I was told the girls have improved," he said at last. "They work hard," Corinne replied, her voice composed though her pulse quickened. "They have potential." "Potential is not enough," he murmured. "Most of them will marry young, many without affection. Few will play again once they do, but they may remember that once they created something beautiful." There was a silence then, long and unwritten. Corinne glanced up and met his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they held something vast, memory perhaps, or regret. "Do you play, Your Grace?" she asked before she could stop herself. He exhaled quietly, almost a laugh. "I did, years ago. My mother insisted I learn the piano, said it would make me tolerable in drawing rooms, and did it." I became a duke. No one dares ask whether I'm tolerable anymore." A smile ghosted across Corinne's lips, unbidden. "What did you enjoy playing most?" "Bach," he said after a moment. "Not for pleasure, for discipline, the order of it." She nodded. "Yes, it demands everything, but gives something back too." He tilted his head. "You speak like someone who understands what it costs." "I do." Their eyes locked, the moment stretched, tension rising not from proximity, but from restraint. He stood several feet away, yet she could feel the force of him, the weight he carried, the way his presence seemed to settle into the air. Then he looked away, the spell broken. "I have to leave for the House of Lords," he said. "There's a debate on the appropriations bill. It won't be pleasant." "I heard mention of it among the staff," she said gently. "It sounds grave." "It is," he replied, "and made worse by those who smile in daylight and scheme in shadow." Corinne did not ask for names. She did not need to. Later that week, she walked into the publisher's office on Holborn Street to collect a new bundle of parchment and ink. The old man behind the desk barely looked up. "Fresh delivery came in," he muttered. "But there's something else." He slid a folded pamphlet across the desk toward her. "Found this stuffed into the door. Thought you might want to see it." She frowned and took it. It was one of the political circulars that now littered every corner of London. Cheap ink, poor paper, but filled with venom. This one bore the insignia of a conservative society aligned with Viscount Harbury. She recognized the seal. It had appeared often in recent weeks, sowing doubt about reforms and questioning alliances. She opened the pamphlet. Her eyes scanned the lines, expecting the usual. But then she stopped breathing. And an anonymous affidavit, signed only with initials, accuses the Duke of Merrow's close ally, Sir Lionel Wintermere, of accepting bribes from foreign industrialists to influence the Royal Appropriations Committee. The testimony comes from an individual previously employed in the household of the Duke of Merrow, signed C.A. The ink seemed to bleed into her vision. Her throat closed. She stepped back from the counter, the air suddenly too thin. The initials, the implication, the lie. "Something wrong, miss?" the old man asked, peering up. Corinne folded the pamphlet tightly, hands trembling. "No, nothing." She walked out into the street, heart pounding like a timpani. Rain had begun again, soft and persistent. She stood beneath the shop's awning, the paper crushed in her gloved hand. Someone was trying to destroy the Duke, and they were using her to do it. She walked quickly, mind racing. Her thoughts turned not to herself, but to Adrian. What this would do to his standing, his influence, his name, but also, shamefully, to how it might reflect on her. Would he believe she had written it? Would he think her capable of betrayal? She thought of his voice, low and steady, the way he had looked at her with something almost like trust. And then she remembered the last time her name had been used without her consent. The summer evening, the garden party, the soft press of Harbury's hand on her shoulder, the sly whisper in Anne Loxley's ear. She had seen it then, but she had been too afraid to name it. Now she saw it clearly. The hand that had orchestrated her fall once was at work again. Harbury. The thought settled cold and hard in her stomach. That night, alone in her attic room, she laid the pamphlet flat on the desk and lit a candle. Its flame danced wildly in the draught from the window. Her ink bottle stood beside it, closed. She did not write. She only watched the shadows flicker across the page that bore her initials without her hand. The city outside continued to breathe, unaware. But within her something stirred, stronger than fear, stronger than silence. A name unspoken now demanded to be heard. The morning was dry and clear, yet Corinne felt as though she walked through fog. The city bustled with its usual clamour. Horses clattering against cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, bells ringing faintly from distant carriages. But it all reached her ears, as if muffled by some invisible pane of glass. She gripped the folded pamphlet in her gloved hand, its cheap paper already softening with moisture from her palm. The ink inside it, however, was sharp, cold, unforgiving. C.A., her initials, her name, once again used without permission. without mercy. She crossed Holborn Street and turned sharply into the alley behind the publisher's office. Her boots met the uneven stone with swift, determined steps. The narrow passage smelled of damp brick and ink, of old newspapers bundled in stacks against the wall. She did not pause to knock. The rear door was ajar. She stepped inside. The small printing room was half-lit, filled with the rhythmic clang of typesetting and the murmur of apprentices. She walked past them unnoticed until she reached the front desk, where Mr. Cratchley, the senior publisher, looked up from a ledger with the bored irritation of a man interrupted. "Miss Ashdown," he said without warmth, "I've no new commissions until Thursday." "I'm not here for commissions," she said, placing the pamphlet down with quiet finality. He glanced at it unimpressed. "Another one of those political trash. They come in by the dozen. My name is in it." Cratchley's brow furrowed. "Your name?" She opened the pamphlet to the offending passage and pointed with a steady finger. "There, an affidavit, an accusation, signed with my initials. That's my hand. Or rather, someone's attempt at mimicking it." Cratchley squinted, then leaned back. "I didn't print this here, but someone typeset it. You've seen this before." He scratched the back of his head. "I subcontract the cheaper pamphlets. Clerkenwell, some low-rate press run by the Crawley brothers. But the work often comes through a courier. I've only spoken to the boy." Corinne's jaw tightened. "Do you know who wrote the content?" He shook his head. "No one signs real names on these things, Miss Ashdown. It's all passed under doors and left in back rooms. But I might know someone who handled this one." He pushed himself up from his stool and shuffled into the rear, returning with a thin young man with spectacles and ink-stained cuffs. "Evan," Cratchley said, gesturing. "This is Miss Ashdown. She wants to know about the pamphlet we received last Tuesday." Evan blinked at her, then at the paper. His eyes widened. "Oh, that one. You remember it?" Corinne asked. The young man flushed. "It came through the usual channel, but the courier gave it to me directly, said it was urgent, said the wording was sensitive and needed to match the original witness account. He stopped, looking suddenly anxious. "Go on," she said gently. "I didn't know what it meant, miss. I just cleaned the type, but the note that came with it, it had a name on it, or not a name, a signet." Corinne leaned forward. "What kind of signet?" Evan swallowed. "A falcon, etched into wax, left on a folded scrap." Her stomach dropped. "A falcon ring," she whispered. The clerk nodded slowly. "I've seen it before. The courier wears it, always dressed like a gentleman, but not the kind who smiles." Viscount Harbury. The memory struck her like a blow. A hand on her shoulder, a voice close to her ear, the glint of a ring in the lamplight 2 years before. She stood, cold despite the warmth of the press room. "Thank you," she said. "That's all I needed." She left with the pamphlet folded neatly once more. Outside, the streets had grown louder, but she moved through them with singular focus. Not toward home, not toward the West Parlour. She walked toward Grosvenor Square, toward Lady Eugenia. The footman at the rear entrance raised a brow as she entered without appointment, but something in her face warned him against protest. She was shown to the small blue sitting room where Lady Eugenia was reviewing letters with her usual poise and precise posture. "Miss Ashdown," the lady said with mild surprise, "you are not scheduled today." "I beg your forgiveness, Lady Eugenia," Corinne replied, curtsying, "but I must speak with you, alone." Lady Eugenia gave a small nod to the maid, who withdrew. Once the door shut, Corinne stepped forward and laid the pamphlet on the tea-table between them. "This was published 3 days ago," she said softly. "It contains a forged affidavit, one bearing my initials." Eugenia's eyes narrowed as she read the passage, then turned a calculating gaze on Corinne. "You believe this was done deliberately?" "Yes," Corinne replied. "And I believe it was done by a man I have every reason to fear." Eugenia folded her hands. "Say his name." "Viscount Harbury." The silence in the room grew thick. "Why?" Eugenia asked at last. "Because he's done it before." And with that, the wall Corinne had kept sealed for 2 long years began to crack. In halting words, she told the story, not the polite, curated version she had shared with sympathetic friends, but the truth. She had been 18, newly introduced to society, invited to a garden party in Hampshire hosted by a minor baronet. Her stepfather had accompanied her, but spent the evening deep in cards with men twice his rank. Corinne had stepped outside for air and found herself cornered, softly, smilingly, by Harbury. He had offered her a glass of wine, whispered compliments too familiar, and laughed when she turned away. The next morning, a letter had circulated claiming she had offered him her virtue beneath the wisteria arch. It was unsigned. But her guardian had received a call from Harbury himself, expressing concern about the rumours and his reluctance to press charges. The implication was clear. She was ruined. And her guardian, desperate to remain in Harbury's good graces, had not defended her. He had sent her away. Lady Eugenia listened in silence. She did not blink, did not sip her tea. When Corinne finished, the older woman stood and walked slowly to the window. "You should have told us this sooner." "I was ashamed," Corinne whispered. "I still am." "No," Eugenia said sharply, turning. "You have no cause for shame, but others do." Corinne's shoulders trembled. "What will happen now?" "You must tell Adrian." A sudden chill passed through her. "No, I cannot. Not unless I must. He must know. But he has enemies waiting to discredit him. If this becomes public, it won't harm only me. It will damage him. Your family, the fund." At that moment the door opened. Adrian stood there. His eyes swept the room, his gaze falling at last on Corinne. She could not read his expression. There was no anger, no surprise, only a heavy stillness. "I was told you came unannounced," he said, his voice quiet. Corinne curtsied. "Forgive me. I did not intend—" "I heard enough through the door," he interrupted gently. "May I see the pamphlet?" Wordlessly she handed it to him. He read in silence. When he looked up again, there was a hardness in his jaw she had not seen before. "You believe Harbury is behind this?" "I do," she said. "And your guardian?" "I believe he traded my future for Harbury's favour." Adrian nodded once, slowly. He did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the pamphlet. "I would understand if you preferred I no longer work here," Corinne said, her voice low. At last he raised his gaze to hers. "No," he said. She blinked. "No. You will remain," he said firmly. "This house will not cast you out for telling the truth." A beat passed, then another. "Though I confess," he added, his voice quieter now, "I find myself furious, not at you, but at a world that allows this to happen without consequence." Corinne's throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. Their eyes met and held, something unspoken vibrating in the air between them. Not affection, not yet, but something deeper, a fragile, growing trust, something not forged, but real. April unfurled in pale golds and muted greys, the skies over London, weeping only in mist rather than torrents. Inside number 4, Grosvenor Square, the mood was one of forced civility, of doors closed just a moment longer than usual, of whispered voices halting when footsteps approached, of glances exchanged behind teacups. The household had grown aware, not of everything, but of something, a disturbance beneath the polished surface. Corinne felt it in the tension of the staff, in the way Lady Eugenia's letters were answered, with curt refusals or not at all. The air crackled not with gossip, but with restraint, as if society itself waited to see whether scandal would bloom or wither. Adrian Whitcomb, however, remained the eye of the storm. He did not raise his voice. He did not alter his schedule. He met with ministers, hosted committee chairs, and reviewed charity correspondence as though his name had not just been tied to whispers dark enough to unravel decades of statesmanship. But behind the closed doors of his study, he allowed Corinne in. It began with ledgers. A pile of financial reports from the Society for the Advancement of Municipal Trade was delivered to Grosvenor Square in a parcel marked private. Adrian summoned Corinne, not through Lady Eugenia, not through a footman, but by a letter in his own hand, brought to her lodging by his personal valet. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. "Miss Ashdown, there is a matter I wish to examine with your assistance. Your eye for discrepancies may prove useful. I shall await you at 4 o'clock. A.W." At the appointed hour, she entered the Duke's study, breath caught in her throat. The room was heavy with carved wood and the scent of parchment and ink. Shelves lined the walls, and a single window admitted the last of the afternoon light, which gilded the curve of the Duke's chair and lit the collar of his dark coat like fire along velvet. "Thank you for coming," he said without preamble. She nodded, unable to summon words at once. "There are inconsistencies in these reports," he said, gesturing to the stack before him. "Donations to charitable funds, some of which pass through the same accounts used by political intermediaries. It seems the bribes were laundered through benevolence." He looked at her then, not as a subordinate or suspect, but as a partner. "You understand numbers," he said simply, "and you know the language of ink." Corinne drew near. They spent the next 2 hours bent over ledgers, side by side, heads close enough for the fabric of his coat to brush the sleeve of her dress, close enough for her to feel the heat of him. Their hands moved in tandem, hers hovering above figures in columns, his finger pausing where a total failed to match its source. "I think this line here," she murmured, "was added later. The ink is fresher, slightly blue in tone." He leaned closer, peering where she pointed. "You're right." Their eyes met. So close, so silent, and then they looked away. The hours bled into evening. A single lamp glowed on the desk, casting shadows along the grain of the wood. The papers grew into towers, marked with ribbons and notations in Corinne's script. She should have gone home hours ago, but neither of them mentioned the time. Exhaustion wore at them both, yet neither stepped away. When Corinne finally stood to stretch her aching back, her sleeve brushed against his hand. He didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said softly. She turned to him. "I don't want gratitude, Your Grace," she said. "I want this to stop. I want to live without watching my name dragged through parlors and print." His voice dropped, quiet and sincere. "Then we will end it." That promise wrapped around her like a mantle. But the next day, the city woke to fire. A letter appeared, unsigned, of course, circulated among the breakfast tables of Belgravia and Kensington. This one did not hide behind coded accusations or vague implication. It named Corinne Ashdown as the Duke's private mistress, a former maid elevated through seduction, now accused of forging affidavits on his behalf in exchange for jewels and influence. The wording was acidic, but worse was the note of certainty, the authority with which it spoke, and it spread like contagion. Lady Eugenia received 2 letters that morning, withdrawing invitations from upcoming musicales. The trustees of the Girls' Charity Fund requested a review of staff interactions, and servants in the Lethbridge household began to whisper behind their hands. Corinne stood by the west window, staring into the square with dry eyes. It was happening again. So swiftly, so cruelly, one rumour, no matter how absurd, could undo her entirely. She packed her belongings in silence, a folded dress, her music folio, a comb her mother had once given her. There was no melodrama in her actions, only sorrow, deep and steady like the tide. She left the note on Lady Eugenia's writing table. No accusations, no protest, just a few lines in neat, even hand. "Please know that I am grateful for every kindness extended to me under this roof. I will not allow my presence to further stain the House of Merrow. I leave with respect and with silence. Corinne Ashdown." But she never made it to the front door. Adrian stood there, blocking her exit. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her, at the valise in her hand, at her bonnet in her other, at the tearless resolve in her eyes. "Where are you going?" he asked. She straightened her spine. "Away. I've done enough damage." "You've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice harder now. "And if I let you walk away, then they win." She swallowed. "They already have." "No." His voice softened and he stepped closer. "I have been called many things in Parliament, Miss Ashdown. Some deserved, some not. But I've never cared half as much about any of it as I do about this." Her breath caught. "I cannot protect what I do not understand," he said. "So I'm asking you, do you still trust me?" The question pierced through the walls around her like light through stained glass. She looked up at him, really looked, the tightness around his mouth, the storm in his eyes. The hand curled at his side, as though it ached to reach for her, but dared not. "I do," she whispered. His shoulders eased just a fraction. "Then stay," he said. Corinne lowered her valise. In that moment something shifted between them, not loudly, not visibly, but deep within. A vow unspoken, a bond forged not of romance or duty, but of belief. He did not touch her, but his presence was a shield, and she remained. Rain painted the windows of Grosvenor Square with long silver rivulets, as though the sky itself wept for all that could not be spoken within those walls. The scandal, once a whisper threading its way through drawing rooms and charity functions, now stood at the very threshold of the house, bold and unyielding. And still Corinne remained. The days had grown colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Invitations no longer arrived with ribboned corners and embossed seals. Names once spoken with ease at the breakfast table were now offered only in low murmurs behind half-closed doors. And always the spectre of her hovered nearby, the music copyist. The girl behind the curtain, the Duke's ruin. Lady Eugenia's composure was unshaken, at least outwardly. She presided over the breakfast table with her usual stillness, sipping tea from her porcelain cup, as though the world outside had not begun to pull away. But behind the steel of her expression, Corinne could feel the strain, the war within a woman who had guarded her family's name for over 2 decades, now asked to choose between silence and conviction. "Miss Ashdown," she said one morning without lifting her gaze, "the Music Fund has requested that rehearsals be paused until further notice." Corinne set her spoon down gently. "Because of me." "Because society is delicate," Eugenia replied coolly. "And delicate things tend to shatter when reality is thrust before them." Corinne's eyes did not lower. "Then perhaps it is time someone stopped handling them with gloves." Eugenia finally looked up. Their gazes held. Something passed between them, not agreement, not yet, but understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of strength shared in different forms. That evening, Corinne did not return to her attic. Instead, she tucked her hair beneath a faded shawl, donned her oldest gloves, and stepped into the city with the firm resolve of a woman who had learned how to move unseen. She visited the print shop on Fleet Street, where pamphlets were inked in haste and bundled by candlelight. The clerk, a narrow-eyed man with a perpetual stain on his cuff, dismissed her at first, until she laid down a handful of coins earned from copying sonatas long after midnight. "I'm looking for anything printed under the name Wyndham or the initials FL, she said, her voice steady. He squinted at her, but money spoke more fluently than titles. "Check the bin near the back," he muttered. She did. And in the dustiest corner she found it, a partial proof bearing the same inflammatory rhetoric as the letter that had accused her. The typeface matched, the tone matched, and scribbled in the margin, in a hasty hand, were 3 initials. FLH, Frederick Locksley Harbury. Her pulse quickened. Over the next several days, she gathered fragments. Letters, drafts, names of donors to societies with suspiciously similar ledgers. She slipped into places unnoticed, back rooms of charities where polite women never dared to question the books, hallways of concert halls where young assistants spoke freely in her presence, never imagining she understood every word. She was, once again, invisible, and yet for the first time it felt like power. Adrian noticed the change. At first it was in the questions she asked, sharp, precise. Then, in the way she arrived to his study already holding answers he had not yet thought to seek. And finally, in the way she looked at him, not as a man to be revered, but as one who must choose. "You've been out late," he said one night, eyeing the smudge of soot on her glove. "I've been listening," she replied. "To whom?" "To everyone who never thought I mattered enough to whisper quietly around." He studied her for a long moment. "It isn't safe." "No," she agreed, "but neither is silence." The storm that followed was not in the sky, but in Parliament. The vote on the military appropriations bill loomed, and with it, the question of whether Adrian Whitcomb, Duke of Merrow, still carried the moral authority he once commanded. Viscount Harbury, meanwhile, smiled at every session. his words laced with civility, his eyes cold with calculation. And through it all, Adrian felt the slow, searing press of something he dared not name. Corinne. She haunted his thoughts. Not just her voice, her wit, her defiance, but her presence. The way she stood by the fireplace, with one hand resting on the mantel, as though she had always belonged in that room. The way her eyes darkened with fury when reading injustice aloud. The way she leaned over his shoulder, breath warm near his cheek as they pored over the same document late into the night. One such evening the fire was low, and the lamps burned soft gold into the wood-panelled silence. Corinne stood beside him, marking a page with her finger. "This total doesn't match the last report. Look here, £40 unaccounted for. The name attached is fictional." He turned toward her. They were close, too close. Her face, lit from below by the lamplight, was luminous in its calm resolve. Her lips parted slightly as she continued to speak, but he could no longer hear her words, only the beat of his own heart, thrumming like a drum in his ears. His hand lifted, slowly, as though drawn by gravity. She did not step back. But just before his fingers reached her cheek, he stopped. The space between them pulsed with something unbearable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Her brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" "For forgetting myself." She took a step back, not in rejection, but in understanding. "You didn't forget," she said gently. "You remembered everything that matters." The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. That night, as Corinne prepared to leave, a letter awaited her on the table in her lodging. The seal was familiar. Her stepfather. She opened it with trembling hands. "Corinne, I was told your name is again being spoken in certain circles. Important ones. I always knew you were clever. Perhaps we both acted hastily. If you are willing to reconcile, I can arrange for you to be received again. Lady Melrose asked after you. I have told her nothing. Your future is still yours to shape. Your affectionate guardian, Edward T. Fenwick." She stared at the words for a long time. Then she took the letter to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched it burn. There was no need to answer. She had already chosen the road he once forced her to abandon, and she would walk it, even if she had to walk alone. But she was no longer alone, not truly, not anymore. The gaslight flickered against the velvet curtains of number 4 Grosvenor Square, casting long golden shadows across the parquet floors. Beyond the glass, the square shimmered with carriages and lanterns, the evening air taut with expectation. A musicale hosted by Lady Eugenia Lethbridge was no small affair, even amid the current chill of scandal. And yet, tonight, every seat had been filled, every eye would be watching, every whisper sharpened. In her chamber on the second floor, Corinne stood before the mirror, motionless. The gown was soft grey silk, the colour of moonlight over river stone. Modest in cut, it bore no unnecessary ornament, only a row of tiny seed pearls at the collar and a ribbon sash drawn just below the bust. Its elegance was quiet, understated, dignified. A borrowed gown. "I had it made for a cousin's coming out," Lady Eugenia had said that morning, her voice carefully neutral. "But she married poorly and left it behind. It deserves to be worn with purpose." Corinne's hands trembled as she adjusted the cuffs. Never had she worn anything so fine, and never had she felt so exposed. In the mirror she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the veiled girl behind the curtain, the ink-stained copyist, the discarded ward. In her place stood a woman prepared to face a room full of people who had once deemed her invisible. A knock. She turned. Lady Eugenia entered carrying a small silk-wrapped box. Her eyes met Corinne's with a gravity that softened, just slightly, at the corners. "Jewelry is unnecessary," Corinne whispered. "This is not jewelry," Eugenia replied. She opened the box. Inside lay a single hair comb, ivory, polished, with a carved motif of laurel leaves. Nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious, but undeniably beautiful. "It belonged to my mother," Eugenia said, approaching. "She wore it the night she refused to marry the man her father chose." Corinne's eyes shimmered. "She never regretted it," Eugenia continued, fixing the comb gently into Corinne's chignon. She taught me that women who do not lower their gaze terrify those who depend on silence. Corinne could not speak. She simply nodded. The clock struck 7. In the hall below, the butler began announcing guests. Lady Eugenia extended her arm. "You will not enter through the servants' corridor tonight." Corinne inhaled slowly. And then, with the composure of a woman stepping into battle, she descended the staircase on Lady Eugenia's arm, each step echoing against the marble with quiet finality. The moment the drawing-room doors opened, the air changed. Gasps were muffled behind lace fans. Voices ceased mid-sentence. Every head turned. Corinne walked forward, neither hurried nor hesitant. She did not lower her eyes. She did not pause to acknowledge the pointed glances or the curious tilt of lorgnettes. Her presence was a rupture in the expected order, a ghost resurrected. She was not on the invitation list. She was not meant to be seen. And yet, there she was, in silk, in shadowed grace, in defiance. Adrian Whitcomb stood near the pianoforte, speaking with a parliamentarian. When he saw her, his words faltered, his spine straightened. His eyes, those storm-blue eyes, never left her. He did not come to her. He did not need to. The room trembled with his regard. The musicale began. A young soprano sang something trembling and sweet. A trio of violinists performed a gavotte. Corinne listened without hearing, her heartbeat counting time faster than the conductor's hand. Her moment would come last. The program ended with scattered applause, and then, in the hush that followed, Lady Eugenia stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "We are honored tonight," she said, "to host not only musicians of fine talent, but a voice of truth." Whispers sparked, some brows rose. Others stiffened. Eugenia's gaze swept the room. "Miss Corinne Ashdown has requested to speak, and this household, my household, will not silence her." Corinne stepped forward. A hush fell. She stood at the center of the room. The chandeliers glinted above her, catching on the pearl at her throat. Her hands did not shake, though her breath was shallow. She held a folder of documents, receipts, letters, records copied in her own hand, and evidence gathered over weeks of silent labor. "I will not take long," she said, her voice calm, clear. "No," came a sharp voice from the rear. "But your presence already has." It was Lady Henslow, thin as a cane, her disdain curling at the corners of her mouth. Corinne did not flinch. "I understand some of you feel I should not speak, that I should have disappeared after my name was ruined, after the lies were whispered. But I came here tonight not to defend my past, but to reveal a truth that has lived too long in shadow." She opened the folder. "These," she said, raising the documents slightly, "are financial records tying Viscount Harbury's associates to payments distributed under false charitable pretenses, funds used to buy votes, launder favors, and destroy reputations." More gasps, audible this time. "I found them," she continued, "because I was forgotten. Because men who hide behind titles and rings believe women like me do not matter, that we will not read, that we will not remember." Her gaze moved slowly through the room. 2 years ago I was accused of impropriety. My guardian abandoned me. My friends disappeared. My name was dragged through parlors by mouths that never once asked for the truth. That accusation was false. It was planted, and tonight I name the man who did it. She turned toward the rear of the room. Harbury stood against the wall, one hand resting lightly on his cane, the falcon ring glinting in the light. "Viscount Harbury," Corinne said, her voice unshaking, "manipulated events to destroy my reputation. He lied, he whispered, and he paid others to do the same." Silence. Harbury laughed once. "You dare accuse me in this room? Without proof? I have the documents, the signatures, the witnesses who will speak when summoned. I have more than proof, my lord. I have nothing left to fear." The words landed like thunder. Harbury paled. Some guests turned away from him. Others watched him with newfound doubt. Adrian stepped forward then, not to overshadow her, but to stand beside her. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice low and commanding. "I have seen the documents. I have traced the path of deception, and I will take this evidence to the house myself." The crowd stirred. Lady Eugenia, still at the edge of the room, gave a slow, approving nod. Harbury, cornered, stepped forward, bluster rising like smoke. "You risk your position, Your Grace, for a fallen woman," he sneered. Adrian's jaw clenched, and then he spoke words that would be repeated across salons for weeks. Miss Ashdown did not fall. She was pushed, and with that, the room turned. Not all, not immediately, but enough. Enough to shift the tide. Corinne did not cry. She did not collapse. She simply exhaled. Later, alone in the corridor outside the music room, she rested her forehead against the wall, her body finally allowing itself to tremble. Adrian found her there. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. She turned to him. Her eyes were not triumphant, only tired. "I told the truth," she replied. "That is all." He stepped closer, not touching, not pressing. "I would follow that truth anywhere," he whispered, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but reverence, respect, and something deeper still, something not yet spoken, but felt. The music room still hummed with echoes, of a voice no one had expected to hear, of truths no one had dared to speak. The guests remained frozen in place, caught between admiration and discomfort, as if rising from their seats too quickly might shatter the delicate veneer of civility that remained. Corinne Ashdown stood at the center of the room, her hands still wrapped around the folder that held more than documents. It held proof, it held memory, it held freedom. Her back was straight, her breath controlled, but her eyes burned with something fierce and undeniable, and then came the voice that sliced through the hush. "Enough of this farce. Viscount Harbury." He stepped forward from the rear of the room, a predatory gleam in his eye, the glint of his falcon signet catching the chandelier's light like a blade. The edges of his smile were too sharp to be gracious, his voice too smooth to be sincere. "You speak of forged records and fabricated truths, but it is you, Miss Ashdown, who has manipulated this household, this duke, and perhaps this very city." Gasps scattered through the audience like seeds on wind. Corinne did not move. Harbury advanced. "How many reputations must you drag through mud to lift your own? How many noble men must be sullied by your ambition?" And then, before anyone could stop him, he lunged. A swift motion, sudden and deliberate, his hand snatching toward the folder in her arms. But he never reached it. Adrian was faster. The Duke of Merrow stepped between them like the drawing of a sword. No raised voice, no shout, only presence. Power in its quietest, most lethal form. His hand closed around Harbury's wrist, not tightly, but with a steadiness that left no doubt. "Do not touch her," Adrian said, each word a low tremor of command. Harbury stilled. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Adrian released him. "You forget yourself," Adrian continued, his voice calm, deadly. "You stand in my house, in my sister's drawing room, and you raise a hand against a guest under our protection. Be assured, you will answer for that." Harbury's mouth twisted. "So this is how it ends. You tarnish your name for her?" Adrian's reply was a blade of its own. "I protect what is true." The Viscount laughed once, bitter and brittle, and stepped back. But the damage was done, and not to Corinne. The next morning, the scandal reached Parliament not in whispers, but in ink. Papers flooded the streets with bold headlines and scathing commentary. Viscount accused at Duke's residence. Allegations of corruption and character assassination. Miss Ashdown speaks. Her name, once used to condemn, was now printed with wary admiration, still questioned by some, but no longer ignored. A public inquiry was called. And for the first time in years, London listened not to the usual voices, but to the cracks in the foundations they had long ignored. The hearing chamber within Westminster was a cold, formal place, stone columns, dark wood benches, and men in cravats who preferred discretion to disruption. But on that morning, it was full. Corinne sat in the private gallery, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed downward. Her gown was navy wool, modest and appropriate, but her bearing was unyielding. She was not here to beg. She was not here to tremble. She was here to witness. Adrian entered the chamber to a chorus of shifting postures and subtle nods. He took his seat with his usual composure, but his eyes flicked upward just once to meet hers. The inquiry began. Testimonies were read. Evidence was introduced. Harbury's allies protested, evaded, deflected, but the paper trail was too clear, too precise, too damning. When Adrian rose to speak, the room fell into a heavy hush. He did not look at his notes. He did not clear his throat. He simply began. "The woman who uncovered this scheme," he said, "was not trained in law. She did not possess the title of auditor or secretary or officer. She was not born into privilege. She was not granted access. She earned it through diligence, observation, and most remarkably by surviving what most would not." A murmur rose, quickly hushed. She was once cast out by the very society that now benefits from her integrity. Her name was maligned, her future stolen, and yet when given the chance to fade, she did not. She stayed, she fought, and she revealed a rot we have long ignored. He turned toward the panel. "Her name is Corinne Ashdown." The silence afterward was profound. In the gallery, Corinne felt her breath stutter, not because he had spoken her name, but because he had spoken it with honor, with truth, and with something else, something deeper, something that hung in the air like the scent of rain just before it falls. The inquiry concluded without theatrics. No one shouted, no one stormed, but the shift was seismic. By the time Adrian exited the chamber, the whispers had changed tone. He found her waiting in the hallway, her hands still folded, but her eyes bright. He did not speak at first. He only looked at her. "You didn't have to say my name," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." She blinked. "Why?" He stepped closer. "Because I am tired of a world where men speak and women vanish. I will not be part of it." From down the corridor, footsteps echoed, measured, familiar. Lord Charrington, Adrian's longtime political adversary, approached. Corinne tensed, expecting another confrontation, but the older man merely glanced between them, then nodded once, curt but not unkind. "I underestimated you, Whitcomb," he said. "Even dukes must learn to listen when the right woman speaks." Adrian inclined his head. "I'm still learning." Charrington's mouth twitched. "Learn faster." He walked away. Adrian looked back to Corinne. She shook her head with a breath of disbelief. "They'll never accept me." "They already have," he replied softly. "They just haven't realized it yet." Outside, the clouds began to part, revealing a sky of soft, reluctant blue. The storm, though not yet past, had changed direction, and for the first time in a long while, Corinne felt not pursued, but followed, not threatened, but seen. As they stepped out into the light, side by side, the world no longer looked quite so divided, not between titled and untitled, powerful and powerless, respectable and ruined, but between those who lied and those who stood. London, despite its towering architecture and practiced elegance, had a way of shrinking around a woman once she had been named, and though the tide had begun to turn, whispers softening, articles retracting, Corinne Ashdown knew well how fragile such reversals could be. A name once sullied was never carried without weight again. Her body remembered the posture of shrinking, even if her spirit no longer obeyed it. The early morning was overcast, a blanket of quiet grey folding itself across the rooftops. In her small rented room off Drury Lane, Corinne stood by the window, her gloved hands resting on the sill, watching the light tiptoe through clouds. She had risen before dawn, as she often did, unsure if she was meant to stay visible now or vanish once more. She had done what she never thought she could, stood before those who once silenced her, and spoke not in defence, but in defiance. The ink had dried on the ledgers, the signatures had been authenticated, the accusations dismantled. Harbury's allies had turned tail, and the man himself had reportedly fled to his estate in Derbyshire, for health, according to a note in the Times. Still, the streets felt colder than usual, not because of weather, but because of uncertainty. She was neither outcast nor accepted. She was something new, and London had not yet decided what to do with her. When the knock came, it was not tentative. Corinne turned, startled. No one knocked at her door. Letters slid under it. Deliveries were left at the stoop. But this was different. She opened it slowly, and there stood Adrian. Not in the shadows, not in a black coat veiled by dusk, but in daylight, broad-shouldered and impossibly real. His eyes looked tired, lined by something deeper than sleeplessness, but they did not waver. "I know I should have written," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I feared a letter would not be enough. May I come in?" Corinne stepped aside, silent. He did not remove his gloves, nor unbutton his coat. He stood in the centre of the modest room as though it were the grandest hall in Parliament, his presence filling it without effort. "I have come to ask something of you," he said, turning to face her, "and I understand if the answer is no." Corinne tilted her head. "Ask." Adrian drew in a breath, held it for a beat. "Will you walk with me?" She blinked. "Now?" "Yes, through Grosvenor Square, through the front door." Her lips parted, but no words came. No servants' entrances, no back alleys, no curtains, no veils, just us, in daylight. He let the words rest between them. Corinne's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but because something long held inside her was stirring again, recognition, perhaps, of the weight of what he offered. "I am not the woman they expect at your side," she said softly. He smiled, and it was like the first sun behind clouds. Then they must change their expectations. Outside, the carriage waited, modest and unadorned. Not the state vehicle, not the one with crests and footmen. This was a personal one, a quiet choice, a deliberate message. As they rode, Adrian did not reach for her hand, but his shoulder brushed hers whenever the wheels dipped into the uneven cobblestones. He did not look away. When they arrived, the coachman opened the door, but Adrian stepped out first and turned to offer his hand, not as a command, not as an obligation, but as an invitation. Corinne took it, and then they walked. Grosvenor Square rose around them, resplendent and disapproving. Gas lamps still flickered despite the hour. Faces peered from behind curtains. A few passers-by stopped outright, mouths parted, but they did not stop walking. Adrian led her not to the tradesman's entrance nor through the side garden, but to the front door of his house, the one with the tall brass knocker and the gleaming handle polished daily by generations of silent butlers. And he opened it for her. Not a footman, not Lady Eugenia. Him. He did not speak until they stood within the hallway, the light filtering through the stained glass window warming the marble floor. "There is to be a formal announcement," he said at last. "That you are to direct the music fund. The board voted unanimously. Lady Eugenia told them if they hesitated, she would publish their reluctance in every broadsheet in London." Corinne let out something between a breath and a laugh. "She has grown ferocious. She has grown loyal." He turned to her then, fully. "And I have grown weary of acting as if what I feel for you must be hidden. I do not wish to speak of what we cannot do. I wish to speak of what we must." Corinne lowered her gaze. "You are a duke. The city watches you. And I am tired of its gaze meaning more than my own choices." Their silence swelled, not awkward, but sacred. Then Adrian took one step forward. "I will not ask again. Only once. Only now. Do you still trust me?" Corinne looked up. "Yes," she whispered, "but I don't know where this leads." He touched the edge of her sleeve, fingertips barely brushing the fabric. "Neither do I. But I know I would rather walk toward uncertainty with you than certainty without you." It was not a grand declaration. It was not fireworks or poetry. It was truth, and that was enough. Their kiss, when it came, was not rushed or breathless. It was the slow unfolding of a bond long tied, the quiet answering of a question neither had dared ask aloud. His hand rose to her face, not with urgency, but reverence. Her breath caught not from surprise, but from recognition. It was not a first kiss. It was a final threshold crossed. Later that day, Corinne stood in the music room, surrounded by the girls whose voices had once trembled behind curtains. Now they laughed openly, weaving scales into play, papers into ribbons. A table in the corner held fresh ink, clean manuscript pages and neatly stacked ledgers bearing her handwriting. Lady Eugenia had stayed near, offering introductions, protection, and, when needed, the sharpness of her name to silence skeptics. Corinne stepped briefly into the hallway to collect herself. It was there, by the vestibule, that one of the younger girls, perhaps 12, perhaps 13, slipped something into her hand, a folded scrap of parchment. The girl said nothing and hurried back into the room. Corinne unfolded the note. In uneven but careful writing it read, "Thank you for showing us what it means to be brave in silk." She held the note to her chest for a long moment, eyes closed. The past had not been erased, but it no longer led her. She had walked through the last door, and on the other side she had found something not even music could name. Not redemption, not revenge, but dignity returned, and love, not in secret, but in sunlight. It began with candlelight, not the grand wax chandeliers of the drawing rooms that once dismissed her, nor the ceremonial tapers used in cathedrals that echoed with aristocratic footsteps. No, these were the soft, humble flames of lanterns held by girls, still in their nightgowns, slippers damp with dew, gathered beneath the flowering arches of a garden just beginning to stir with dawn. The wedding took place at 6. No trumpet, no procession, no seating plan, just a still morning broken by birdsong and the hush of fabric moving across grass. Lady Eugenia wore a gown of pale mauve silk and stood as witness, chin lifted with serene defiance. She held Corinne's bouquet, freesia gardenia, a single white rose, and did not cry, though her eyes glistened. Adrian wore no insignia, no medallion, only a cream waistcoat beneath a dove-grey coat, his hair brushed back, his gloved hand steady as he turned to the woman standing beside him. There were no pews, no officiant raised on a dais. The minister read from a small book under a trellis of ivy. The words, simple and ancient, carried easily through the crisp morning air. Corinne wore no veil. Her gown was ivory cotton lawn, hand-stitched by a student from the music fund. No train swept behind her. No diamonds sparkled at her ears, but the buttons down her back were mother of pearl, and the lace along her sleeves had belonged to her mother. As they joined hands, her fingers trembled once, then stilled in his. Adrian said her name as though it were a vow by itself. Corinne answered without hesitation, her voice low but unshaken. When the minister declared them husband and wife, no cheers erupted, no music swelled. Instead, the girls surrounding them, half a dozen witnesses in borrowed shawls and Sunday slippers, began to hum. A soft chorus, wordless and pure, rose among the climbing roses and settled like benediction over the garden. Later that morning London woke, and with it came the murmurs. Some scoffed, some whispered, some, bitter in their expectations, turned away. But others, especially those who had felt the sting of judgment, the weight of social cruelty, spoke differently. They spoke of her courage, of her eloquence, of how the Duke of Merrow had wed not for lineage nor alliance, but for honour. Corinne did not return to the shadows. Instead, she stepped fully into the life she had helped restore. Not just her own, but that of countless others. The girls of the Music Fund now had a name to write on applications, a place to study, and a patroness who understood what it meant to be silenced and heard again. Within weeks, plans were set in motion. A second music school opened in Lambeth, this time for girls whose families had been bankrupted by war or scandal. Corinne personally selected each instructor, sitting for hours to hear proposals, refine curricula, and argue for funds. When resistance came, because it always did, she addressed it with calm defiance, her eyes level, her logic unflinching. The Ashdown Fund for Music and Truth had become more than a footnote in a charitable register. It was a statement. She walked to Parliament with Adrian one afternoon, not through the servants' hall, but the members' gallery. She listened as he spoke in session, not about foreign tariffs or naval deployment, but about education, dignity, and the role of civic art in shaping national character. His words were measured, but firm. And when he mentioned her, "My wife, whose guidance sharpens my own," no one dared interrupt. Behind closed doors, her presence changed the rhythm of his household. Servants no longer whispered when she passed. Visitors no longer hesitated to be introduced. And Adrian, always dutiful, always composed, found himself pausing more often, touching her hand during conversations, lingering in doorways just to watch her reading by the fire. It was not the passion of novels, explosive and consuming. It was steadier, deeper, built on bruises healed together. One afternoon, weeks after their wedding, Corinne returned to the music room. Not the drawing room in Mayfair, where silence once held her captive, but the true music room, now expanded, sunlit, alive with energy. The curtain was gone. In its place stood open shelving, lined with instruments and handwritten scores. Girls ran back and forth, tuning violins, straightening hymnals, arguing gently over tempo markings. One of them, barely 10, was attempting to teach another how to read treble clef. Corinne stood just inside the doorway, unseen for a moment. She took in the room slowly, the way the light struck the polished floors, the echo of laughter, the faint scent of lavender and ink. A young teacher approached, 20 perhaps, with red curls escaping her pinned braid. "Your Grace," she said with a small curtsy, "I didn't see you arrive." "I wanted to observe," Corinne replied with a soft smile. "Before they noticed." The teacher hesitated. "Would you like to speak with them?" Corinne considered. "No. Let them play. Let them forget I'm watching." The teacher smiled and returned to her pupils. Corinne turned, walking toward the far wall. A new brass plaque had been affixed above the entrance, polished to a gleam. The engraving was simple: the Ashdown Fund for Music and Truth. No title, no flourish. Just her name, standing alone, not shamed, not questioned, not hidden. She reached out and touched the edge of the plaque. She remembered the first time she had entered a room like this. Hidden, watched, named without consent. She remembered being told to speak softly, to dress modestly, to wait quietly. She had done all of it, and still, it had not been enough to protect her from ruin. But it had forged something else, not just strength, not just resilience, clarity. She turned, her eyes drifting over the scene, the girls, the sunlight, the music starting once more. And for the first time in years, Corinne did not brace herself for what would come. She simply breathed it in. Outside, the bells of St. George's chimed the hour. Inside, a woman once cast aside now stood at the helm of something enduring. She was the Duchess of Merrow. She was Corinne Ashdown, and her name, once broken on the tongues of gossips, was now etched in brass, sung in halls and carried by those who had once feared to speak their own. A name rewritten, and this time by her own hand. The wind in Grosvenor Square had changed. Once it had carried the scent of coal smoke and carriage wheels, the echo of whispered reputations and closed doors. Now it stirred the amber leaves beneath wrought-iron gates, weaving through the trees planted by schoolgirls in honor of the woman who taught them to stand upright, even when the world bent against them. The Ashdown Fund had grown. What began as a single music room now reached 5 boroughs, 2 provinces, and 1 distant parish in Yorkshire, where a former servant's daughter played violin each morning for the baker's son, who walked 2 miles to hear her rehearse. The plaque bearing Corinne's name had dulled slightly with time, but its meaning had only deepened. It was no longer just a name. It was a landmark. Inside the Mayfair house, the walls bore little resemblance to the rooms they once were. A library had replaced the formal dining room. The ballroom had been split in 2, half reserved for rehearsals, half for gatherings of those whom society once called inconvenient. And at the heart of it all, in the music salon filled with lilac light, stood Corinne. She was 37. Her hair, darker now than it had been in youth, was twisted into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. A single grey strand had appeared just above her temple, which Adrian loved, quietly, possessively. He said it made her look like a heroine in an epic poem, the kind that spoke of surviving storms instead of just longing for them. She stood beside a window, a letter in one hand, the other resting on the curve of a small wooden chair. It was a child's chair, painted with wildflowers, worn at the edges, stained with ink. Their daughter had outgrown it last year but refused to let it be taken to the attic. Sophie Whitcomb Ashdown had her father's solemn eyes and her mother's defiance. She was 7. She played the pianoforte without sheet music and once asked a member of Parliament why girls couldn't attend the Royal Academy if they could already play better than half the boys. Adrian had nearly dropped his teacup. Yes, there had been a daughter. No son followed, though the physicians had warned it might not be possible after such a difficult first labour. Corinne hadn't wept when the months passed without change. She already had what many titled women never knew, a child born of choice, not duty, a husband who looked at her with reverence after nearly a decade, a name no longer reclaimed, but lived in, fully. Adrian had changed, not in the manner of hair turned silver or posture softened by age, though those too came in time. He changed in the quiet hours, in how he listened, how he governed. His speeches were shorter now, sharper. He no longer asked for permission to defend what was right, nor hesitated to speak of corruption, even in the presence of those who once toasted to Harbury's wit. The Viscount had vanished from public life. After the inquiry, his allies turned their backs one by one. There had been a brief attempt to slander Corinne again, anonymous letters, an insinuation in a minor periodical, but it withered in the face of public sentiment. When Harbury's holdings were seized and his country house sold, no one mourned. He was last seen on a steamer bound for Cairo. Some said he drank himself to sleep in the desert sun. Others claimed he gave lectures on empire in some dusty university no one remembered. Corinne never spoke his name again, but she did speak of the girls who had been silenced, the boys who feared shame more than cruelty, the women who copied music behind curtains because to be seen was to be suspect. And the world slowly began to listen. Lady Eugenia still lived in the house, greyer, thinner, but no less regal. She read poetry in the afternoons, claimed she hated fuss, and wore pearls even when ill. She had never married. When asked, she'd answer, "The only man worth marrying already married the right woman." Then she'd sip her tea and pretend not to see the tears in Corinne's eyes. That autumn, they hosted the 8th annual performance of the Ashdown Girls Ensemble. The programme included original compositions, a piece dedicated to suffrage in the colonies, and a poem written by Sophie, read aloud with excessive seriousness and too many pauses. Corinne laughed until her eyes burned. Adrian applauded louder than necessary, and somewhere in the audience a woman in widow's grey whispered to her neighbour, "I heard she used to be a scandal." The neighbour replied, "Now she's the standard." After the performance, Corinne wandered the corridors alone. The children had gone home. The lanterns flickered. She paused outside the music room, listening to the echo of silence. 8 years ago, she had stood behind a curtain in that very space, invisible. Now the room had no curtains, just a tall window, open to the October sky, and her name carved above the door, not in brass this time, but in wood, as if it had always belonged. She placed one hand on the frame. Outside, Adrian was waiting in the carriage, their daughter asleep against his shoulder. He would look up in a moment, wondering where she'd gone. He always did, and she always returned, not because he summoned her, but because he never tried to keep her from becoming what the world said she could not. In 8 years, their love had not faded. It had matured, thickened like oak grown in storm-weathered soil. It was no longer breathless, but it was unshakable. She stepped into the night and drew her cloak close as the wind rustled the square. The future would not be gentle. But then again, neither was she, and the world, at last, had learned her name. What a journey we've shared. Ashes at Grosvenor Square is more than just a love story. It's a testament to the quiet resilience of a woman who refused to let shame define her, and the man who learned that true power lies not in title or wealth, but in choosing what is just, even when the world demands silence. Corinne's path reminds us that even when doors close in our face, even when our name is dragged through the mud, we still have the right to rise, to speak, to love. And sometimes healing comes not from revenge, but from rebuilding, from turning scars into bridges, and from teaching others that their voices matter too. If you reach this point in the story, write "Brave in Silk" in the comments. That way, I'll know you stayed with us until the very end, and so will others. Let's show how many hearts were touched by this tale. Your comment could help someone else find the courage they didn't know they were looking for. If you'd like to support the small team behind these stories, you're warmly invited to send a super thanks here on YouTube with whatever amount feels right to you. Every bit goes into creating more unforgettable romances like this one. And if now isn't the moment to support financially, that's perfectly okay. Sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who loves period dramas is a beautiful way to help us grow. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't miss the other powerful stories waiting for you in the cards above. Each one is filled with emotion, conflict, redemption, and unforgettable love, crafted just for you. Thank you, truly, for being here, for feeling every note, every breath, every tear. We'll see you in the next story.